It's a strange and deeply humiliating feeling to be treated like a trespasser on the porch of the home you've lived in for 30 years. To have a stranger, someone you've never met, tell you that you are no longer welcome in the place where you raised your family, where you shared a life with your wife, where every corner holds a memory. My nightmare didn't start with a catastrophe. It didn't start with a missed mortgage payment. The house had been paid off for a decade. It started with something so trivial, so utterly ridiculous that it still sounds like a bad joke when I say it out loud. It started with a garden hose. That forgotten garden hose, which I had accidentally left uncoiled by the side of the house for a day, was the seed from which a forest of legal and financial misery grew. It was a minor infraction, a $10 fine, according to our HOA's own rules. But in the hands of our new, ruthlessly ambitious HOA president, it became a weapon. That $10 fine was deliberately inflated with hundreds, then thousands of dollars in bogus charges, non-compliance penalties, legal review fees, administrative processing fees. It was a mountain of debt manufactured out of thin air. Before I could even understand what was happening, that manufactured debt became a fraudulent lien, a legal chain wrapped around the title of my home. And then came the final, unbelievable move. They took me to court, and using the lien they had created as justification, a judge granted them a receivership. It's a legal term most people have never heard of, and I wish I was still one of them. It meant a court-appointed stranger now had legal control over my property. One day I was a retiree, a widower living a quiet life in the home I owned outright. The next, that stranger was on my doorstep, telling me I had 48 hours to pack my life into boxes and vacate the premises. They had legally stolen my home. They saw an old man, someone they thought would be an easy target. They assumed I would be too confused by the legal jargon, too intimidated by the threats, and too tired to fight back. They figured I would just give up and walk away. Another casualty of their predatory playbook, leaving them free to rent out my home and collect the income. But they miscalculated. They didn't count on the fact that I had nothing left to lose and a deep, burning need for justice. This is the story of a grueling, multi-year legal battle to fight back against a corrupt HOA, to navigate a system that seemed designed to protect them and to expose their scheme for what it was, a deliberate predatory attack on a vulnerable senior citizen. This is the story of how I won, and how I made sure they would never be able to do this to anyone else ever again. But to understand how we got to that point, you have to understand the 30 years of quiet that came before the storm. Before the lawyers, before the lien, before I became a stranger in my own home, there was just life. A simple, predictable, and deeply cherished life in a modest home in a quiet Georgia subdivision. My wife Maria and I bought the house when we were young, and we filled it with the beautiful, messy business of raising a family. After she passed, the house became my sanctuary, a place so saturated with her memory that I never truly felt alone. Her prize-winning roses still bloomed every summer in the garden she so lovingly tended. The worn spot on the armchair by the window was still shaped to the curve of her body from all the years she spent reading there. I lived a quiet life, governed by simple routines: coffee on the back porch in the morning, a walk around the block in the afternoon, and evenings spent with a good book. I was a model homeowner, not because I was afraid of the HOA, but because I respected my home and my neighbors. I mowed my lawn, paid my dues on time, and for 3 decades the HOA was little more than a name on a newsletter, a background entity that kept the community pool clean and organized the annual picnic. For most of those years, the board was run by other retirees, people I knew from the grocery store, people who operated with a gentle hand and a dose of common sense. The rules were there, but they were treated as guidelines for being a good neighbor, not as a legal code to be ruthlessly enforced. But a few years ago, that all changed. There was an election, and a new young woman named Karen was elected board president. He ran on a platform of restoring property values and enforcing the bylaws as written, a phrase that sounded reasonable on paper, but was terrifying in practice. Karen was a man who seemed to derive a deep, personal satisfaction from his newfound power. He walked the neighborhood not with a friendly wave, but with a clipboard and a critical eye, searching for infractions. The friendly, relaxed atmosphere of our community was replaced overnight by a low-grade tension. Suddenly, neighbors were getting violation notices for things that had been ignored for years. A basketball hoop that was the wrong color, a small crack in a driveway, a satellite dish that was 2 inches too far to the left. Karen saw the thick book of HOA covenants not as a tool for community management, but as a weapon. Before I tell you how he turned his sights on me, I'm curious. Have you ever had to deal with someone in a position of petty authority? Someone who seemed to enjoy making rules and wielding power just for the sake of it? Let me know your story in the comments. I read through that book of bylaws when this all started. Buried in the dense legalese was the source of all of Karen's power. It gave the board the authority to not only levy fines, but to add on administrative fees, legal review fees, and collection costs at their own discretion. And it contained the HOA's nuclear option, the power to place a lien on a property for any outstanding debt, no matter how small. It was a clause designed to protect the community from truly negligent homeowners, but in the hands of a man like Karen, it was a tool of extortion. I watched the changes in the neighborhood with a sense of unease, but I never thought it would affect me. I was a quiet retiree. I followed the rules. I kept to myself. I didn't realize that in Karen's eyes, that's exactly what made me the perfect target. I was a man living alone, someone he probably thought wouldn't have the energy or the resources to fight back. He was about to find out just how wrong he was. The quiet life I had so carefully preserved was about to become a battleground. And the first shot in that battle was fired over something so utterly insignificant, it would be comical if the consequences hadn't been so devastating. My garden hose. I had spent a pleasant afternoon tending to Maria's roses and had simply forgotten to coil the hose back onto its hanger. The next day, a crisp white envelope was taped to my front door. Inside was a neatly printed violation notice, complete with a color photograph of the offending green hose lying in a gentle curve on my lawn. The fine was $10, with a note to cure the violation within 7 days. It was a classic Karen move, petty and unnecessarily formal. I rolled my eyes, coiled the hose, and mailed a check for $10 the same day. In my mind, the matter was completely and utterly closed. That was my first mistake. I had assumed I was dealing with a rational system. I learned very quickly that Karen's HOA wasn't a system of rules. It was a system of power, and he was determined to use it. My next quarterly statement arrived, and I saw that the $10 fine was still listed as an unpaid balance. Below it was a new $50 charge labeled failure to cure violation fee. I was baffled. I had fixed the problem the very same day. I immediately called the HOA's management company, and the receptionist, in a tired voice that told me she'd had this kind of call before, informed me that any disputes had to be taken up directly with the board president. So, I called Karen. His tone was immediately hostile, as if my call was a personal inconvenience. I explained the situation calmly, telling him I had coiled the hose and paid the fine. Our records indicate the violation was not cured in the specified time frame, he said, his voice dripping with bureaucratic finality. I tried to argue, to explain that I had a canceled check and could even show him the neatly coiled hose. But he cut me off. The fee stands, he said. If you have a problem with it, you can submit a formal dispute in writing. Then he hung up. I was no longer just annoyed, I was angry. This was a shakedown, plain and simple. But I was still trying to be reasonable. I wrote a formal letter as instructed. I included a copy of the canceled $10 check and a dated photograph of the coiled hose on its hanger. I explained the situation clearly and respectfully, and I requested that the $50 penalty be removed. I sent it via certified mail so I'd have proof he received it. The response was another escalation. My next statement arrived, and it was even worse. It now included the original $10 fine, the $50 non-compliance fee, and a new, outrageous $100 charge labeled legal review fee. They were charging me for the time their lawyers supposedly spent reading my dispute letter. The total was now $160, and it was quickly spiraling out of the realm of reason and into the absurd. I realized then what was happening. This was a trap. I was an accountant. I understood numbers. And I understood the predatory accounting trick they were pulling when the next statement arrived. I had continued to pay my regular quarterly dues, but they were applying my payments not to my current dues, but to the oldest debt on my account, the bogus fines. This meant that my regular dues were now technically late, which of course incurred another $75 late payment penalty. In just a few months, a $10 fine had metastasized into a debt of several $100s, all through a deliberate predatory campaign of manufactured fees. My polite confusion had morphed into a constant gnawing anxiety. Every trip to the mailbox was a source of dread. Every new envelope with the HOA's logo made my heart pound. I was a senior citizen living on a fixed income, and I was watching this fictional debt spiral out of control, feeling utterly powerless to stop it. I was being gaslit by a spreadsheet. The final straw, the one that broke my resolve to handle this politely, was when I tried to attend the monthly board meeting to plead my case in person. I wanted to stand up in front of my neighbors and expose what was happening. But when I arrived, Karen, clipboard in hand, informed me that I would not be allowed to speak. "Your account is an ongoing legal matter," he said loudly, for all the other attendees to hear. "It cannot be discussed in an open forum." He was publicly shaming me while simultaneously silencing me. It was a masterful, cruel move. I felt trapped, cornered, and completely alone. But the worst was yet to come. About a week later, another certified letter arrived. By now, I knew the routine. I sat in my car in the post office parking lot, my hands shaking, a familiar feeling of dread washing over me. I tore it open. The words swam before my eyes, a dense forest of legal jargon. But I didn't need to be a lawyer to understand the phrase at the top of the page, printed in bold capital letters, official notice of lien. The debt, which they now claimed was over $2,000, had been officially filed as a lien against my property. My home. My paid-off, 30-year sanctuary. The place where every corner held a memory of my wife. It was now legally held hostage, encumbered by a debt that had started with a garden hose. The rage I felt was so immense it almost made me dizzy, but underneath it was a cold, deep, and terrifying fear. This wasn't a dispute anymore. It was an existential threat. They had put a chain around my life, and I knew with a sickening certainty that they were not going to stop pulling until they had taken everything, and pull they did. That lien, that legal chain around my home, was just the prelude to their main act. The next certified letter, which arrived 2 months after the lien notice, was even more chilling. It was a summons to appear in court, not for the lien itself, but for something called a petition for receivership. I didn't know what that meant, not really, but the pit in my stomach told me it couldn't be good. I managed to find a local attorney, a young man who mostly handled traffic violations, and he looked grim as he explained it to me. They're trying to take control of your property, Mr. Davies. If a judge grants it, they can rent it out, collect income, even force a sale to cover their alleged debt. My blood ran cold. They weren't just holding my house hostage. They were trying to steal it outright. The day of the hearing arrived with a cold, gray morning. I walked into the courthouse feeling like a lamb being led to slaughter. Karen was there, of course, looking smug in a cheap suit, flanked by two sharp, expensive-looking lawyers. They had the air of people who did this often, their briefcases thick with documents, their faces radiating a casual confidence. I, on the other hand, felt like an alien in a foreign land. My young lawyer, bless his heart, looked nervous. He was clearly out of his depth against the HOA's legal team. The courtroom was small, sterile, and intimidating. The judge, a stern-faced woman with tired eyes, listened patiently as the HOA's lead attorney began his presentation. He painted a picture of a negligent homeowner, a senior citizen who had willfully ignored his responsibilities, allowing a small debt to balloon into a substantial sum, leaving the HOA with no recourse but to seek the court's intervention to protect community interests. He presented a meticulously crafted binder of documents, copies of my original violation notice, the fabricated statements showing the escalating fees, and the official lien notice. It all looked so legitimate, so official, so damning. My lawyer tried his best. He pointed out the trivial nature of the initial violation, the inflated fees, the fact that I had attempted to pay the original fine. But the judge seemed to cut him off every time he tried to delve into the why of the fees, always bringing him back to the fact of the outstanding balance. The HOA's lawyers presented canceled checks for what they claimed were their legal fees for pursuing the lien, costs they were now adding to my debt. It was a self-perpetuating machine of financial destruction. The judge kept looking at the numbers, at the paper trail of their manufactured debt, and it felt like she was seeing only their carefully constructed narrative, not the malicious intent behind it. I sat there, listening to the legal jargon fly back and forth, feeling utterly helpless. It was like watching a play where I was the main character, but I had no lines, no say in the outcome. My heart pounded, a frantic drum against my ribs. I wanted to stand up and scream, to tell the judge that this was all a lie, a scam, a deliberate attempt to take advantage of an old man. But my lawyer had warned me to stay silent, to trust the process, a process that seemed to be failing me spectacularly. The hearing was surprisingly brief. When the judge finally spoke, her voice was even, devoid of emotion, and utterly devastating. She stated that given the undisputed outstanding debt and the HOA's statutory right to protect its assets, she was granting the petition for receivership. A receiver would be appointed and they would take immediate control of my property, my home, my sanctuary. It was gone, just like that. The gavel came down with a soft thud, but in my ears it sounded like a thunderclap, shaking the very foundations of my world. I walked out of that courthouse in a daze, the cold air hitting my face. Karen offered a smarmy, triumphant smile, and for the first time I truly hated him. A cold, quiet, consuming hatred. He had done it. He had taken my home. 2 days later, the receiver arrived. His name was Mr. Jenkins, a portly man in a too-tight suit, accompanied by a locksmith and a security guard. He stood on my porch, the same porch where Maria and I had shared so many peaceful evenings, and handed me a legal document. It reiterated the court's order. I had 48 hours, he said, to pack my personal belongings and vacate the premises. He spoke with a chilling professionalism, as if he were repossessing a car, not stripping a man of his entire life. I stood there staring at the front door, the solid oak door that had welcomed me home for 3 decades. The locksmith stood idly by, his tool bag slung over his shoulder, waiting for me to leave so he could change the locks. Every object in the house suddenly felt foreign, alien. These weren't just things. They were touchstones, memories, the physical embodiment of my past. And now, they were no longer truly mine. The next 48 hours were a blur of numb panic and frantic packing. My children, bless their hearts, dropped everything to help me. We moved Maria's antique china, my old photo albums, the armchair she loved so much. Each box was a piece of my life, extracted from its proper place. I remember standing in the empty living room, the echoes of my family's laughter now replaced by a vast, echoing silence. The receiver watched me leave, his face devoid of emotion. As I stepped out, he nodded to the locksmith, and with a metallic click, the locks were changed. The front door, once a symbol of home and safety, became a barrier. I was officially homeless. My home, my entire life, had been legally stolen from me, all because of a garden hose and the predatory ambition of one man. It was the point of no return. And from that point of no return, there are only 2 paths forward. You can give up or you can fight. For the first few weeks sleeping in the guest room of my son's house, I honestly wasn't sure which path I would take. The humiliation was a constant, heavy blanket. I was a man in my late 60s, a man who had owned his own home for 3 decades, a man who had always prided himself on his independence. Now I was a long-term guest living out of boxes, a burden on my own children. I would wake up in the morning and for a split second I'd be disoriented, expecting to see the familiar pattern of the sunlight through my own bedroom window. Then the reality would crash down on me, and the shame would start all over again. The receiver, Mr. Jenkins, had wasted no time. A week after I was forced out, a for rent sign went up in my front yard. My home, my sanctuary, was now just another rental property, a source of income for the very people who had stolen it. Seeing that sign was a new kind of pain. It felt like a desecration. My neighbors would call, their voices a mixture of pity and outrage, telling me about the strangers now living in my house. The despair was a physical weight, and I felt myself sinking under it. I stopped going for walks. I stopped calling my friends. I just sat in that guest room, surrounded by the ghosts of my life, and I felt myself starting to disappear just like Karen had wanted. The turning point wasn't a single dramatic event. It was a slow burn, ignited by the love and anger of my children. They refused to let me surrender. My daughter, Sarah, would sit with me for hours, not letting me wallow. "Dad," she said one afternoon, her voice fierce, "this isn't just about the house. This is about who they are and who you are. They are bullies who prey on people they think are weak. You are not weak." Her words were a splash of cold water. She was right. The shame I was feeling, that's what they were counting on. My silence was their victory. That night, the grief, which had been a suffocating fog, began to crystallize into something harder, colder, and much more useful: anger. A quiet, righteous anger. They had taken my home, but I would not let them take my dignity. My first lawyer had been a mistake. We needed a specialist, a warrior. My son spent a week researching, making calls, and finally found a small boutique law firm that did one thing and one thing only. They sued predatory HOAs. The lawyer we met with was a woman named Miss Albright. She wasn't like any lawyer I had ever met. She had the eyes of a hawk and a no-nonsense demeanor that was instantly reassuring. I sat in her office and laid out the entire sordid story, from the garden hose to the locksmith. I showed her the mountain of fabricated fee statements, the threatening letters, the notice of the lien. She listened intently, her expression growing more and more grim. When I was finished, she looked at the pile of papers, then looked at me. "Mr. Davies," she said, her voice sharp and clear, "what they have done isn't just a breach of contract. This is a textbook case of a bad faith lien and wrongful foreclosure. They didn't follow procedure. They created a procedure to target you. We're not just getting your house back. We're going to sue them for damages, for the emotional distress they've caused you, and for every penny they have spent on their lawyers trying to defend this." For the first time in almost a year, I felt a flicker of hope. The first thing Ms. Albright did was file a powerful countersuit. We were no longer on the defensive. We were on the attack. The lawsuit alleged wrongful foreclosure, breach of fiduciary duty, fraud, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. The moment that suit was filed, the dynamic shifted. I was no longer a delinquent homeowner. I was a plaintiff, a victim of a predatory scheme. But Miss Albright warned me this would be a long, slow grind. "They're going to fight us with everything they have," she said. "They'll try to bury us in paperwork, delay the hearings, and bleed us dry. We just have to be more patient and more prepared than they are." And she was right. The first year was a blur of depositions, motions to dismiss, and endless procedural hearings. It was a war of attrition, fought with reams of paper and billable hours. But we were building our case. We were in exile, but we were fighting. Miss Albright's legal team began the painstaking process of discovery. We subpoenaed 5 years of the HOA's financial records, every board meeting minute, and every email Karen had ever sent from his HOA account. We weren't just looking for evidence in my case, we were looking for a pattern. And slowly, buried in the thousands of pages, the pattern began to emerge. We found 2 other senior citizens who had been hit with similar inexplicable escalations of fees. Both had been intimidated into paying. We were proving that my case wasn't an anomaly, it was their business model. The first Christmas away from my home was the hardest. My son's house was filled with love and laughter, but it wasn't mine. Then there was a second Christmas. The years were starting to pile up, a heavy testament to the slow, grinding wheels of justice. But we never wavered. Every motion the HOA filed to get our case dismissed was denied by the judge. Every delay tactic they used only made us more determined. With each small victory, that flicker of hope grew a little brighter. We were still on the outside, but we were fighting our way back in, one legal document at a time. The battle was far from over, but for the first time it felt winnable. And the place where you find out if a battle is truly winnable is in the stark, quiet confines of a courtroom, on the day of the final hearing. After 2.5 years of legal trench warfare, that day finally arrived in the fall of 2025. Walking into that courthouse, I felt a strange sense of calm. The nervous, terrified man from the first hearing was gone, replaced by someone who had spent years preparing for this single moment. My lawyer, Miss Albright, was by my side, her briefcase filled not with hope, but with cold, hard facts. Across the room, Karen and the HOA's legal team looked as arrogant as ever, but I could see a flicker of unease in their eyes. The day of reckoning had finally come. Their lawyer went first, making the same tired argument they had been making for years. He painted me as a difficult, non-compliant homeowner who had allowed a small debt to spiral out of control through his own stubbornness. He held up the bylaws as if they were stone tablets from the mountaintop, arguing that the board had simply been exercising its fiduciary duty. It was a polished, professional performance, but it was a story with a fatal flaw. It was a complete and utter lie. Then it was Miss Albright's turn. She stood, and the entire atmosphere of the room shifted. She didn't begin with legal arguments. She began with a single simple photograph projected onto the screen for the judge to see. It was a picture of my coiled garden hose. "Your Honor," she began, her voice cutting through the silence, "this is where it all started. A $10 fine for a violation that my client cured and paid for the very next day. We are here today because the defendants decided that this $10 resolved issue was grounds for a campaign of predatory financial harassment that resulted in my client, a senior citizen on a fixed income, losing his home." She then put up a second slide. It was a devastatingly simple timeline. On the far left, it said, "Day 1, $10 fine, paid." On the far right, it said, "Day 180, $2,150 line." And in between, she laid out the anatomy of their fraud. She listed every single bogus fee, one by one. The $50 failure to cure fee for a violation that had been cured. The $100 legal review fee for a dispute letter their own bylaws gave me the right to submit. The $75 late payment penalty triggered only because they misapplied my regular dues. It was a step-by-step masterclass in how to manufacture a debt out of thin air. Then she brought out the evidence of their pattern of targeting other seniors. She presented the board's own financial records, showing 2 other elderly homeowners who had been subjected to the same rapid, inexplicable escalation of fees, both of whom had been intimidated into paying. The final act was calling Karen to the stand. He swaggered up full of confidence, but it quickly evaporated under Miss Albright's precise, surgical questioning. She put the HOA's bank statements on the screen. "Karen," she asked, "can you please show the court the invoice from your law firm that corresponds to this $100 legal review fee you charged my client?" He couldn't. "Can you explain why the late fee was applied when my client's check for his regular dues was cashed a week before the deadline?" He stammered, talking in circles about their accounting procedures. Ms. Albright's final question was the kill shot. "Karen, is it the official policy of your board to intentionally inflate minor fines with unsubstantiated fees to a point where you can legally place a lien on a resident's home and then petition for a receivership? Is that your business model?" Karen's face went pale. He sputtered, he denied, but the damage was done. The judge had seen everything. When the arguments were over, the judge, a man with a reputation for being tough but fair, took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes. He looked at the HOA's legal team with an expression of profound disappointment. "I have presided over hundreds of HOA disputes," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "I have seen arguments over paint colors, fences, and holiday decorations, but in all my years on this bench, I have never seen such a clear, calculated, and unconscionable abuse of power." He looked directly at Karen. This was not debt collection. This was a predatory scheme designed to either extort money from a senior citizen or, failing that, to seize his single greatest asset. You use the bylaws not as a shield to protect your community, but as a sword to attack one of its most vulnerable members. It is, frankly, disgusting. The courtroom was utterly silent. My heart was in my throat. "Therefore," the judge continued, his voice ringing with finality, "this court rules in favor of the plaintiff. The receivership is terminated, effective immediately. The lien is declared null and void, as it was demonstrably filed in bad faith. Furthermore, the court orders the defendants to pay all of my client's legal fees and an additional sum in punitive damages for their fraudulent and malicious conduct. He banged the gavel. It was over. 2.5 years of stress, of homelessness, of fighting from exile. It all came to an end with that one final sound. I looked at Karen. His face was a mask of pure, stunned disbelief. He had been so sure he would win. I felt a wave of relief so powerful it almost buckled my knees. It wasn't the loud, triumphant victory I might have imagined. It was a quiet, deep, and profound validation. After years of being told I was the one in the wrong, the truth had finally prevailed. And when the truth prevails in a courtroom, the ripples are felt far beyond those four walls. The news of the judge's verdict, especially his scathing rebuke of Karen and the board, spread through our community like a shockwave. An emergency meeting was called, not by the board, but by the residents themselves. For the first time in years, the room was packed, filled with neighbors who were angry, emboldened, and done with being intimidated. Karen was forced to resign in disgrace, his little kingdom of clipboards and bogus fees crumbling around him. But the consequences didn't stop there. My lawyer, Miss Albright, was a true warrior for justice. She took the judge's ruling and the mountain of evidence we had gathered, the manufactured invoices, the pattern of targeting seniors, and forwarded it all to the State Attorney General's office. Our personal battle became the catalyst for a much larger, state-level investigation into predatory HOA practices. My fight for my own home had inadvertently become a fight for the rights of countless others. For me, though, the most important moment was much quieter. It happened a week after the verdict, when the newly elected and very humbled HOA president came to my son's house and personally handed me a new set of keys to my own home. There were no cameras, no fanfare, just a simple, sincere apology. Driving back to my house that day, I felt a nervous anticipation I hadn't expected. For over 2 years, this place had been a battleground, a source of pain and stress. I wasn't sure what it would feel like to walk back inside. I put the new key in the lock, and the door swung open. The air inside was stale and silent. A thin layer of dust covered everything, a testament to the time that had been stolen from me. But as I walked through the quiet rooms, touching the back of my wife's armchair, looking at the photos on the wall, the feeling of it being a battleground began to fade, replaced by something else. The deep, unshakable feeling of being home. This ordeal taught me a hard lesson about how vulnerable we can be as we get older. There are people in the world, people like Karen, who see seniors not as neighbors, but as easy targets, assuming we won't have the energy or the resources to fight back. For a while, they were almost right. But they failed to account for the stubborn dignity of a person who refuses to be erased, and the love of a family that will not let you fight alone. My home is quiet again now, but it's a different kind of quiet. It's not the silence of loneliness or the tense silence of a coming storm. It's the sound of peace. A peace that is all the more precious because I had to fight so hard to win it back. And that is a victory worth every single second of the battle. If this story resonates with you, please consider sharing it and helping others find the courage to stand up for what's right.